Today on Ag News Daily.
When we talk about producing 18% of the world's beef with 6% of the world's cattle, a lot of that's what we're talking about, the efficiency in our system, the fact that nothing gets wasted, everything finds a home or a market somewhere. So each one of these trade discussions is consequential to the cattle and beef supply chain.
Well, welcome back to the weekly edition of the Ag News Daily Show. This is Tanner.
This is Delaney.
We started that last week. Do you think anybody caught on?
I don't know. We'll find out if we get any listener comments.
I can't wait for summer. We're finally going to get some warm weather. It is National Burger Day?
I think, is it today? What is today's date? I actually don't
today is May 30th. May 30th.
We're a little off.
Have a burger.
Yeah, have a burger.
It should be good weather. We saw a slow-moving system move through the Midwest earlier this week, with another round of showers expected to move into the western states this weekend. Soil moisture has improved across much of the Midwest region, which brought some good news for many farmers who have wrapped up their planting. But in parts of the South, soggy fields continue to delay planting, with June right around the corner. Time seems to be running out. In the northern plains, it was a similar story, as recent rainfall helped boost those soil moisture conditions and ease drought concerns. After a few lingering showers midweek, conditions turned drier, giving farmers a better window for some field work. I know we've got some warmer weather in store for us. Some isolated showers may develop in over the weekend, but eyes are now on a larger system that's expected to move into the northern plains Monday night into Tuesday. That could bring widespread rain throughout the middle of next week. So we've got a little bit until the summer solstice, but I think a lot of farmers could see a little bit of bigger smile with some extra heat units.
Yeah, but we're still seeing some ponding here in central Iowa, a lot of wet weather conditions. Nonetheless, though, farmers seem to make some solid planting progress on corn and soybeans. Favorable weather across much of the Midwest and Plains helped push planting progress along through some key states. Although we do remain behind schedule in a few areas due to some heavier rains. According to the USDA's latest crop progress report, 87% of the nation's corn crop is now planted, with 67% already emerged, both ahead of the 5-year average. This was also the first week that USDA released crop conditions for corn, with 68% of the crop rated good to excellent. As we look at soybeans, planting is also ahead of pace, with 76% in the ground compared to the typical 68% at this point in the season. Emergence stands at 50%, well above the usual 40% for this time of year, and winter wheat conditions dipped slightly, with 50% rated good to excellent, down 2 percentage points from last week. 75% has emerged ahead of 70% on average, and spring wheat progress remains strong, with 87% planted, 60% emerged, and 45% rated good to excellent. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in our market segment, so stay tuned. As we transition here into some news, the USDA this week announced they have set aside another $1 billion for aid payments for those livestock producers affected by drought or wildfire in 2023 or 2024. The Emergency Livestock Relief Program payments will cover grazing losses due to eligible drought or wildfire events from those 2 consecutive years. The American Relief Act of 2025 provided funds for emergency relief payments. This program is the first of 2 payments authorized to assist with eligible losses suffered by livestock producers. FSA will announce additional ELRP assistance later this summer. According to the USDA's website, the agency is leveraging existing livestock forage disaster program data to streamline payment calculations and expedite relief, and payments are expected to be automatically issued for producers who have an approved LFP application on file.
Yeah, I did see that as well. $1 billion sounds like a lot, and not.
It's not when you get it spread across all the livestock producers.
Staying on livestock headlines, last week the U.S. Meat Export Federation held its spring conference in Fort Worth, Texas. Keynote speaker Randy Blach, CEO of CattleFax, shared some insights on the cattle industry, saying that the herd is in a rebuilding effort and may finally be gaining momentum. Blach said and explained that fed cattle supplies remain tight, with more processing capacity than cattle available to fill it currently. This shortage extends to non-fed cattle as well, with significant declines in cow and bull slaughters as producers work to stabilize their herds. He added, while the herd is expanding, the growth is slow and gradual. Blach predicts January 2025 will mark the low point for the beef cow herd. However, he emphasizes that per capita, beef supplies have remained relatively flat, and with recent price increases, they are driven by that strong demand. In fact, beef demand is currently at a 37-year high that is fueled largely by improvements in the quality of the animals being produced. I know when you go to the grocery store, you can feel some of the expense coming with that demand.
Yeah, well, maybe no end in sight, though, for that consolidating herd and stabilizing here at these tighter margins.
That's right. Well, we do see coming up information around the pesticide bill. Hundreds of ag groups this week sent a letter to Congress asking them to enact a bill protecting access to certain pesticides. This is led by organizations such as the American Soybean Association, the National Corn Growers Association, and the National Association of Wheat Growers. They pushed Congress to enact an agricultural labeling uniformity act. This bipartisan bill would protect access for farmers and the public to safe, well-regulated pesticides, according to that letter that was sent. The letter also raised concern that some states had begun to regulate pesticides in a manner contradicting decades of scientific guidance from the EPA themselves. But the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act establishes the EPA as the authority for making decisions on how these pesticides should be labeled and used. As the letter noted, states are permitted to regulate the sale and use under FIFRA, but are preempted from creating additional labeling requirements or requiring different labels and packaging within their state. Those moves by the states risk creating an inconsistent patchwork of state pesticide labels that could complicate sales and access to crop protection tools. The labeling demands the states also risk jeopardizing public confidence in the EPA's authority and science-based regulations. The groups are stating that this letter went on to ask Congress for clarity about whether the states have the authority to simply regulate the sale and use of pesticides and cannot impose labeling or packaging requirements that are different from the scientific conclusions of the EPA. So seeking a bunch of clarity there and unity, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. But could be detrimental for crop protection tools long term if we don't get clarity from Congress. Switching tracks here to talk food safety. In a press release on Monday, Secretary Rollins announced a $14.5 million increase in federal reimbursements to support state meat and poultry inspection programs. The funding aims to help states continue essential food safety operations, especially as many have faced budget shortfalls in recent years. Without this boost, some state-run programs were at risk of scaling back or shutting down, potentially disrupting meat supply chains and raising food safety concerns. The funding ensures inspected American-produced meat and poultry can keep moving from processors to dinner tables across the country. The National Association of State Departments of Agriculture and several ag leaders from across the country praised the move this week. Officials from states including Iowa, Georgia, South Dakota, and Texas say the funding will protect consumers, support local farmers, and, of course, boost rural economies. The increase is part of President Trump's 2026 budget proposal, which also calls for congressional support to secure long-term funding for these types of programs moving forward.
Well, our next headline is tied to the screwworm and getting an update from Secretary Brooke Rollins. It seems to be a very large concern for cattle producers and growers across the U.S. Secretary Rollins said the fight against the New World screwworm has been ramping up with a new $21 million investment in a sterile fly facility in Metafa, Mexico. The facility will double fly production to combat the parasite which threatens livestock. As a part of ongoing efforts, strict import controls remain in place. These include continued suspension of live animal imports from the affected areas in Mexico. This will be reviewed every 30 days. The USDA is also using border inspections, quarantines, and targeted surveillance to prevent the parasite from entering into the United States. Rollins emphasized that the collaboration with Mexico is critical to these efforts. She says the goal is not only to contain the pest, but to eradicate it, protecting American agriculture and food security. Who'd have thought breeding and developing a larger fly population
would prevent a screwworm
would be the solution. But meanwhile, technical teams from both countries are in meetings regularly to coordinate these surveillance efforts, improve animal movement controls, and remove regulatory hurdles that could slow down the response if something were to happen.
Well, to add to that headline, Tanner, we did see late this week, that USDA's chief veterinarian said the U.S. will likely resume Mexican cattle imports by the end of the year, after that halt was put in place earlier this year due to the spread of screwworm. Although imports have been indefinitely suspended from Mexico, Chief Veterinarian Rosemary Sifford says it's hard to say exactly when those imports will resume, but for sure they will resume before the end of the year, unless something, she says, drastically changes. No new cases of screwworm have been reported as farther north than one detected about 2 weeks ago. That was about 700 miles from the U.S.-Mexican border, so far enough away that sounds like officials feel confident, I guess, that we'll see that wrapped up here by the end of the year. But wrapping up some of our final headlines here this week, Tanner, President Trump's big, beautiful bill passed the U.S. House of Representatives last week, of course, by a single vote, but stalled out this week in the Senate. Elon Musk criticized President Trump this week, saying he was disappointed by the bill and what it means for Doge. The bill would increase the federal deficit by about $3.8 trillion by 2034, extending the Trump administration's 2017 tax cuts and boosting border security spending, amongst other things. It still faces plenty of hurdles as the Senate tries to pass its own version, and Republican Senate leaders are saying they hope to get it to the president's desk by the 4th of July.
That's right, and don't forget, next week here in the Des Moines area, we will house the world's largest pork-specific trade show. That's right, you guessed it, the World Pork Expo is back. The two-day event will take place June 4th through the 5th at the Iowa State Fairgrounds and will bring together more than 10,000 pork producers and ag professionals from across the world. It's not too late to register now and to come visit our great state of Iowa next week. So we look forward to that event and hopefully see some of our friends.
Yeah, that's always a great event to go to, and getting some good, tasty pork treats is always one of my favorite highlights, as well as seeing folks from across the industry. Tanner, this week we're visiting and talking cattle once again. It seems on par with the rest of our news. When I was in D.C. a few weeks ago, I caught up with Ethan Lane of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association to talk about trade, tariffs, and the distinct quality of American beef, and of course, the new world screwworm. So let's dive into that interview. So as we think, Ethan, about some of the impacts, of course, in the agricultural industry, tariffs have been a hot topic. Yeah. No surprise that we've been covering a lot on the podcast. I want to get in a little bit more specific today with you, the impact we're seeing in the beef industry. Before we get to that, Ethan, tell us just a little bit, 10,000-foot overview. Here we are in Washington, D.C. this week. What's the sentiment? What's the climate from NCBA's perspective?
Looking for somewhere to put our hands on our knees and catch our breath after a couple back-to-back marathons over the last few months. We knew the beginning of the second Trump term would be kind of like being shot out of a cannon, and it certainly has met all of those expectations. The president and his team knew what they wanted to accomplish. They hit the ground running, and that has meant for all of us in the lobbying community, either struggling to keep up or trying to make sure we're paying attention to what these different issues are and triaging kind of what impacts us, what may not, what we can benefit from, what our producers are going to be interested in. And it has been a lot of activity in the last few months across a range of issues. So, we're getting to this kind of post-100 days moment. Everyone's going to catch their breath a little bit. I think even the president and his team are kind of taking stock, and then off they're going to go continue to push on some of these major agenda items.
Yeah, I like that you called it a marathon. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We're in this for the long haul. But, I've heard a lot of sentiment, I would say, from rural America, from farmers and ranchers, maybe echoing some concern about the difference in this Trump administration versus the last Trump administration. And maybe part of that is pacing. Can you speak to at least a little bit maybe of why the sentiment has felt this different?
Well, we've never been in this kind of situation before where you had a president leave office after 4 years, have 4 years to think about what he would have done differently, and then another shot at it. And 4 years to really plan. We saw the America First Policy Institute created while he was out of office. Brooke Rollins obviously ran that organization during the last 4 years. They had a lot of cabinet secretaries and former administration officials really thinking about, okay, what did we miss? What would we do differently next time? What does this need to look like? And so, yeah, I think because of that, you do see a lot quicker movement. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, and they're pushing forward with that. So it is a different pace. It is a different urgency. I think everyone's looking at that midterm. Certainly when you have divided Congress, there's a little bit more of a long-term stalemate feel. When all of that control is on one side of the aisle, I think in this town in particular, everybody starts to get a little bit nervous, like, okay, this is gonna go away. And so what can we accomplish while we have all the levers, ostensibly on one side at once? Now, that sentiment doesn't really account for the fact that, Speaker Johnson is still dealing with incredibly tight margins on Capitol Hill. Certainly things like a farm bill have still proven to be elusive. But on the administration side, this is a president who believes he can do a lot on his own steam. He's certainly taking that approach and trying to hit a lot of different marks at once. And we're dealing with that across a range of those issues, whether it be on the labor front, whether it be on the trade front, whether it be, in some of the diet and health space, obviously very new entrants to the Trump tent, as it were, as part of that kind of Robert F. Kennedy Maha contingent. We're seeing it obviously in the culture wars and the ESG and some of those initiatives as well. But all that has an impact on staffing. It has an impact on resource allocation. I think a lot of those stakeholders that thought they were going to get one thing are having to kind of account for the fact that, I knew you were going to clean out bad stuff and do all these things, but I didn't think that meant my favorite program, right? Or I didn't think you meant that bucket of workers that powers the packing plant where I send my cattle. So it's kind of like that old phrase, it's a recession when your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression when you lose yours. Certainly this is not that, but it has that feel to it, I think. And so as people get a little more comfortable with what the president's doing and how he's doing it, and a few of these things are wrapped up, I think hopefully that'll give everybody a little bit better sense of what we're seeing up close as far as the intent and what they're trying to accomplish here. And maybe that's why we have a little bit more, calmness to us than those that are watching it down in the country. Because we're talking to the policymakers, we're talking to the Trump team. We know what they're trying to do. They've been incredibly open and supportive, and we've had a great dialogue with them. So, it's one of those things where the closer you are to it right now, I think the better you feel about what they're trying to do and how they're going about it.
So as we then start to think of narrowing our issues in a little bit on beef-specific issues, we've seen Secretary Rollins in office now. She's making a lot of tours across rural America, talking to different organizations like NCBA. Yeah. When you have her ear, what are some of those issues you're really pressing on with her?
Well, right now, I think it really is one of those things where you got to look at what's possible in this environment, right? We have 160 pages of member passed policy, right? It's every issue under the sun. Right now, there are a few obvious items happening in Washington. There's the reconciliation process. There's the essential nature of those tax provisions from 2017 that have to get extended to protect producers that have escalating land values in their backyards that they've never contemplated before. Helping the secretary to understand that pressure on those producers around the country. Obviously, the trade engagement we've seen from President Trump and his team, the tariffs and everything that goes along with that, starting with Mexico and Canada right here in our backyard, that has everybody's attention. They're very focused on the certainty of our supply chain right now. We have, I think, more cattle on feed past 180 days right now than we've had in maybe ever, but definitely in a very, very long time. So, you can see those little sort of calculations in the eyes of producers around the country that are kind of trying to figure out how to account for some of these things as the president uses these tools to try to get some work done. But certainly across the board, I think those are the things that everybody's watching. And then the animal health crises that we can't seem to get away from, whether it was high-path avian influenza and the threat we were concerned about last year. Obviously, it's still out there, but with a little more information about what it is and what it's not. Now New World Screwworm has captured a lot of imagination as we watch it move up through Mexico. Certainly something on the minds of those border state producers. We would like for producers one level of states above that, or maybe two, to be thinking about the fact that it could be coming to their backyard next. And this is one we're going to need all hands on deck to make sure that we get this thing pushed back down. And then, obviously some of those sort of inside government issues that we know are going to become an issue. Dietary guidelines is still, circulating out there with a set of recommendations that were completely unhinged from that group put together by the last administration. Reduce red meat intake because it's just sort of, been deemed bad by these folks. Account for that by beans, peas, and lentils. But the high caloric nature of that means you got to reduce other things like starchy vegetables. And it just creates this rusty lawn chair of an approach that doesn't seem to have a point beyond just we hate beef, in that committee. So we're looking at some of those things too and trying to figure out how that may be impacted by the Maha crowd that's in place, RFK and his influence. Certainly Secretary Rollins is a huge supporter of U.S. beef. And so there's some of those issues too that we can't forget about. They're perking along in the background, and they may not be on the front page today, but they will be soon enough.
You mentioned a myriad of different issues then that you're focused on. I'd like to dig deeper into a couple of those. Let's start with trade and tariffs first. We've got some potential trade negotiations on the table. We've heard rumors of China maybe willing to come to the table, Japan, Italy, EU, others, Mexico, of course. Walk us through maybe the short-term and long-term impact of what the scenarios are that could play out here, both as it relates to the U.S. beef industry, but also we have to think about corn because so much of the corn we produce walks out of our country.
It does. A lot of the markets that we're talking about are already really good markets for U.S. beef. And one of the things that we keep reminding folks in this conversation is what it is we send overseas. We're not really sending ribeyes and things like that overseas. We're historically exporting those things that don't have a robust market here in the United States. The U.S. is the best beef eating market in the world. There's no better place to sell beef than here in the U.S. So we sell all the good stuff right here at home that meets that American palate. We send tongues, offal, rounds, short plate, things like that to markets like Japan, South Korea, China. Those are highly valued items in those markets and those diets. And we fill that niche, and it's what allows us to be so sustainable. When we talk about producing 18% of the world's beef with 6% of the world's cattle, a lot of that's what we're talking about, the efficiency in our system, the fact that nothing gets wasted. Everything finds a home or a market somewhere. So each one of these trade discussions is consequential to the cattle and beef supply chain. When you talk about $425 or so in export value on each carcass, that's a big number. That means that any sort of loss somewhere means money out of producers' pockets. That means that any disruption in those supply chains means challenges to how those cattle move, how they get bought. We already have the most complex set of commodity markets in the world in the U.S. cattle and beef industry. Any additional complications are not terribly welcome usually. But the president is trying to accomplish some things on that trade front that have long been on U.S. cattle producers' radars. We've been trade bait or a carrot or a stick in negotiations with other countries for a very long time. And we have a lot of those relationships that need a little bit of attention because of that. Certainly Europe and some of those countries that have a lot of non-tariff barriers that prevent U.S. beef from coming in at the scale that their consumers would like to see. The little bit of beef that does go into the European market and the UK market gets snapped up immediately. It's a highly valued product over there. It's very different than their domestic offerings. It's very complementary to those offerings. If you look at the Asian markets, we have great business into Japan. We have great business into South Korea. Quite frankly, from the beef industry position, we don't need anything there. So, we know there are some other issues that are outside of our area, automobile tariffs and things like that. Our hope is that they get some kind of a resolution there and get off the field in those countries, quickly and get on to some of those other trading partners like China, where we know there are myriad problems to be addressed, not just with us, but other parts of the supply chain as well. Australia, a great ally of the U.S., a little bit of a rough trading partner on the beef side, 20 years of access for the Australians into the U.S. market. They've enjoyed it to the fullest. They've sold $30 billion worth of product almost here in the U.S., while continuing to misplace our paperwork in Australia. 20 years of not allowing fresh beef imports into the Australian market for a variety of, slightly questionable excuses. it's enough. And so we're grateful that the president made mention of that in the Rose Garden during his remarks. It's on his radar. He knows it's something that's important to U.S. cattle producers. And we're hopeful that this is one of those situations that he can get some movement on and maybe get it put to bed.
Ethan, as we think then about domestic consumption, cash has hit some all-time highs. We've seen a really strong bull market now for multiple years. We're heading into summer grilling season, so those seem like very positive, bullish factors for the market.
Yeah.
But that's being, on the other side of the coin, competing against some very bearish factors, continued inflation, high prices at the grocery store, maybe continued high prices with some of these tariffs. What's your outlook here for this bull market in the cattle side?
Look, just like during COVID, when we kept talking about supply and demand, right? And the fact that everyone was looking for all different reasons to attribute, low prices to, when the reality most economists pointed to was supply and demand. Well, we are still in an environment where we have very high demand for our product, even at those elevated prices, and a very low supply of cattle. I think they harvested 559,000 last week. That's well off of what we would expect this time of year. We're still in an environment where we don't have enough of what we need to meet demand. So even with all those pressures, it's still a very good time to be selling cattle and turning it into steaks. So we're keeping an eye on those factors, obviously. We want to make sure consumers stay engaged. We want to make sure that even with those price environments, even with that uncertainty, the one thing they can rely on is when they get home at night, there's a burger waiting for them, or a steak, or fajitas, or any of the things that, we all look forward to around the kitchen table, and that those are still accessible to them, and that at the quality level that they're expecting. We're still delivering that, and we're still delivering better quality beef in the U.S. right now than anyone on planet Earth has ever had the opportunity to purchase. And I'm not overstating it when I say that. The genetics, the production practices, the end product, it's never been any better than U.S. beef is right now. So it's not a mystery that people can't get enough of it. It's a better product than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's a better product than anyone's ever seen. That spurs demand.
Is there a concern with factors like screwworm, for example, impacting the already small herd and pushing prices higher simply because we don't have enough product in the market?
Certainly. And again, that's one of those things where certainty in the marketplace is king. That volatility a lot of times in the futures market in particular, I think is uncertainty about what's the administration going to do, what's the screwworm going to do, right? We can't control what the fly does. But looking at the response that we have now, looking at how seriously the administration is taking this, Secretary Rollins sending that very pointed letter to the Mexican government a week ago, demanding that they take this as seriously as we're taking it, demanding that they figure out how to make sure that our contractors that are flying those planes down there can get that 100 million flies deployed on that target zone 7 days a week to ensure that we're holding this incursion at the point on the map in Mexico where it is now is job number one. But we're already up on the hill having conversations with appropriators about the money necessary to build a facility for New World screwworm sterile male flies here in the United States. We know that the 100 million a week we're generating in Panama is enough right now geographically to hold that fly where it is in central Mexico, but it's not enough to beat it back down to Central America and get it contained back in its box again. So regardless of how effective that barrier is now in central Mexico, we need those extra flies. We need that productivity. So this is one of those things where we kind of have to walk and chew gum. First week in office, the administration took on that border issue. They got those protocols in place. So we do have cattle crossing, just not at the volume that we would expect in a normal environment. And that's to do with the fact that, obviously we want to be extremely careful that we're not crossing cattle that could be bringing this fly across into the U.S. And we've been delighted that the rejection rates have stayed on par with what they would be normally. And that protocol at the border is working the way it's supposed to work. So we're going to have to just do all those things at once to keep the supply chain safe and predictable.
And not to put doom and gloom or fear into anyone's mindset, but can you give us a comparison? Screwworm, does it compare to, African swine fever, for example, on the hog side? What would that impact be if we do see screwworm impact and come into the U.S.?
This is one of those where make sure your kids are out of the room, but Google the pictures of what screwworms do to an animal, to that soft tissue. They're extremely destructive. They can be deadly. They're incredibly hard to combat. Not technically hard, right? Ivermectin gets it done, but when they're swarming and they're hitting every available orifice, that's an insurmountable problem. And all those producers in Texas in the 60s that had to beat it back will tell you, we do not want to experiment with what this might look like on U.S. soil again. It would be a massive hit. And, the cost of a facility like this, $200-300 million, seems like a lot of money until you start contemplating the cost both in fighting New World screwworm on U.S. soil and the losses to producers across those impacted states. This is a bargain at this point, and we need to jump on it and make sure we get a handle on this before it becomes a problem.
Great. Ethan, before I let you go, is there any other issues you're focused on in your role as Senior Government Affairs Official for NCBA?
We're continuing to watch this reconciliation process, trying to see if there's some light at the end of the tunnel for the Farm Bill as part of that process. They're now calling it, I think, officially the Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025. Got to stick with the branding, but looking at what's possible here. All the committees are doing their work right now. They're going through the details of each of their different subject matter areas to see if it'll fit in that process. And we keep reminding folks, reconciliation is not appropriations. We talk about, gosh, we'll just stick it in the appropriations bill. You can't do that with reconciliation. We're all getting an education on the bird rule and those requirements, that threshold in the U.S. Senate in order to pass muster. That's the work that's happening right now, and we're keeping an eye on that process. Had a great conversation with Chairman Thompson last week and his team. They are doing everything they can to bring this situation to a successful close, and they're doing it in the most difficult environment I can imagine up on Capitol Hill. So we're keeping a close eye on that. We want to make sure those tax provisions get extended. We want to make sure Speaker Johnson is successful in achieving this bill, delivering a win for the president so they can get on to other things, and that's definitely capturing a lot of attention right now.
Perfect. Well, Ethan, thank you so much for your time and keeping the voice of the farmer and rancher in mind when you're out on Capitol Hill.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate that conversation. U.S. ethanol production has increased last week, according to the Energy Information Administration. Their recent report shared output averaged just over 1 million barrels per day, which is up 2% from the previous week, as more plants finished seasonal maintenance. Production was also up 17,000 barrels higher than the same time last year. We did see our stockpiles fall to 24.944 million barrels, the lowest level since January. That's a drop of just over 500,000 barrels from the week before, but still 732,000 barrels higher than this time last year. However, ethanol demand slowed on mixed signals. Operating margins at the average Iowa ethanol plant dropped slightly, according to the Iowa State University survey, but they still remained positive. The USDA will release new estimates for corn used in ethanol production in their June 12th report. What do we see, though, happening in markets for this week, Delaney?
I think definitely when we look at the outside markets, Tanner, the thing that took center stage was some tariff news once again. A couple of headlines that came out Wednesday and then Thursday, but on Thursday, a federal appeals court temporarily reinstated most of President Trump's tariffs a day after a trade court had ruled that the president had exceeded his authority in imposing those tariffs. So the outside markets on Wall Street rallied on Wednesday, and then Thursday they were a little uncertain about what the future would look like there. But coming off the holiday weekend, weather was certainly top of mind for the grain markets and many traders here in the United States and in Brazil. Concerns about a larger Brazilian crop pushed corn futures lower this week as a few Brazilian private firms raised their production forecasts, on average about 2 million metric tons higher than what the latest USDA May WASDE report forecasted. Additionally, with wet conditions continuing to persist in the eastern Corn Belt, there's now talk of acres shifting from corn to soybeans, but we likely won't see much confirmation of that acreage shift until later in the growing season, if not post-harvest. So will markets react to that? Time will only tell, but taking a look here, December new crop futures slid about 8 cents lower on the week. Meanwhile, soybeans have had a pretty quiet week with not much news to push the bulls or bears to center stage. And as we look at wheat contracts this week, all three wheat complexes started the week off with nearly double-digit losses as hard red winter wheat plummeted 13 cents in the July contract on Tuesday. Chicago July contract lost 16 cents, and spring wheat was the only contract not to see double-digit losses on July, losing about 9 cents on Tuesday. So all in all, coming off that holiday weekend, a little bit of an ugly trading week. We'll see how things shore up here on Friday heading into the weekend. But weather is definitely going to be the focus point here because, as we know, farmers are going to be watching to see what kind of a weather story shapes up here for some sort of summer rally.
Yeah, I do think it would be interesting to continue to press deeper into the South American weather side of things. Maybe we're due to have Mr. Snodgrass back on for an update.
Yeah.
Also, we haven't had a lot of updates on Russia and Ukraine lately, so maybe a couple of things for us to dive in for you guys next week. But if there's other topics like that we haven't covered in a while, I had a flashback on the ethanol news. We used to cover ethanol every week for you. So if there's something like that you want to hear or listen, make sure you comment and leave us a message on all our social media platforms. Check us out and give us those suggestions. But for this week, Delaney, what do you say? Should we let the listeners go?
Let's let them go.